Oh no, Tesla economist changing his mind on things yet again. Sure, that's me. I'm not the kind of person to set a narrative and do what I can to support said narrative. My opinion changes, especially when more information comes to light. So it's probably wise to subscribe so you can keep up with my current analyses. It's said that it takes a good investor to sell their long positions when they eventually realize the company they're investing in isn't quite what they thought, even if it requires taking a loss. However, a great investor will have the conviction to change their long position to short. Now, firstly, just to be clear, I'm not at all referring to Tesla. I am as long as I've ever been with that stock. My point is not to set yourself on a path that you want and then reinforce it with confirmation biases and echo chambers. Be true and honest to yourself. If the facts contradict your beliefs, then don't ignore them, especially when it comes to investing. There is a strong narrative about the Chinese EVs are going to dominate the US, something similar to the Japanese did in the 70s. By the way, no one ever seems to mention how successful Volkswagen was in the US at that time with the Beetle, the car that was in production for longer than any other model in history, even longer than the Model T, yet we don't hear people saying that Volkswagen would dominate the US. It seems a strange narrative. Also, the majority of Americans likely aren't huge fans of Chinese brands. A car is more than just some plastic item you buy at Walmart. It's something that you identify with. The brand is an extension of yourself, something that Henry Ford failed to realize, but GM did, and GM eventually overtook Ford as the largest auto manufacturer in the world as a result. Henry Ford just thought the cheaper the car, the better, and eventually had to close down the Model T factory, and 18 months later came the Model A, but it was too late. But in the US, there's probably about 15 to 20 million cars a year that consumers want to buy, and the consumers are moving to electric in a big way. Yes, Tesla might be able to produce 5 million or so for the US market in a few years, which is a great contribution, but that does leave a huge discrepancy on the rest of the demand. I've recently spent over a week or so researching Chinese EVs, and my conclusion is that it will be tough for the Chinese to enter the US. But on the other hand, there is no other EV alternative other than Chinese. No one else is making enough EVs, right? Sure, but these EVs the Chinese are making are not up to the standard a US consumer expects. And there are alternatives. Obviously, there is still ICE, and maybe these legacy companies aren't as delusional as we think. Maybe a US consumer would still rather own an ICE car over a Chinese car, especially if the Chinese EV simply isn't practical, possibly not as safe, doesn't have sufficient range, doesn't handle so well, and dangerously underpowered. I'm not sure enough consumers will buy a car simply because it's electric. Just look at how much effort Tesla had to put in making their EV superior in every single way to a typical ICE car, and at the same price point. Safer, faster, cheaper to run, advanced tech features, oh yeah, and it practically drives itself. I think the Chinese cars may only win on the cheaper to run category. Again, a massive potential inconvenience of lack of Chinese service centres. Yes, there may be a lot of Chinese EVs, but there will also be a lot of Chinese manufacturers, which means no economies of scale, no XPeng service centre in every city. Also, the Chinese only really offer sedans that have any reasonable range. If you look at any of their crossovers, then they're all under 200 miles of range, at least those using LFP batteries, which really isn't suitable for the vast majority of American drivers. Of course, they don't offer a pickup truck either, so their actual market segment they can only really target is about 1/3 of US vehicles anyway, and they have a poor offering at that. But Americans can have electric that does meet their requirements, the best of both worlds, or perhaps the worst of both worlds in some respects, but a potential suitable solution nonetheless. Yes, I'm talking about plug-in hybrids. With these EV rebates, it's assumed that the US union-made autos will have perhaps $8,500 rebate on their plug-in hybrids, which is a pretty good discount. Of course, legacy autos will milk these rebates. They will bring out a PHEV in all their popular models, and they'll advertise them relentlessly and offer outstanding finance terms. Now, I've never once suggested that the Chinese EVs are trying to compete with Tesla, despite the comments I get, but the US PHEVs will be the cars that will compete against the Chinese. They will cost a lot less to build than a fully electric BEV. The legacy autos are probably capable of making them in volume production too. They have a huge discount in this rebate, and they can also be driven as zero emissions, perhaps 30 or so miles of range, but also suitable for longer road trips when necessary, even if it's occasional. They can get 600 or so miles on a tank compared to perhaps 250 miles with a Chinese EV. It will be interesting to see if the legacy autos can convince their customers to buy a PHEV over electric, whilst they're also trying to sell their own electric vehicles. Yes, it's a very tough job they have, but they do have resources. One being the backing of the US government, which carries a lot more weight than the CCP. They also have a hugely profitable ICE business to carry them, for now at least. Now, people are saying that I am anti-Chinese EVs. I'm not. I'm just pointing out how I see this happening. I'm suggesting that Americans prefer American brands, which doesn't make me anti-Chinese EVs. But I am happy to admit that I don't like any of the Chinese EVs myself. I'm an avid car enthusiast. After Tesla, I would much rather have an electric BMW or something. I love driving too, and the Chinese EVs do not drive or handle so well. They're too heavy and slow. Their powertrains are nothing like Tesla's. Their software and motors don't come close. Actually, the legacy autos are even a lot better at making EVs than the Chinese. That's right. Perhaps we're not giving legacy enough credit after all, and it's not fair to compare them against Tesla, as everyone comes up short against Tesla. What am I talking about? Well, let's compare a legacy and a Chinese EV. The closest comparison I could think of was the Ford Mustang Mach-E versus the Neo ES6. The Neo uses a 100 kilowatt-hour battery. The Ford uses a 91 kilowatt-hour battery. The Ford does 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds. The Neo, 4.6. The Ford has 305 miles of range EPA. The Neo, only 265 miles. And as far as I can tell, the Neo costs more too. $48,000 for the long-range Ford compared to perhaps $55,000 for the Neo. Of course, prices don't really mean much if neither of them don't make any profit. Perhaps the benchmark Tesla has set is just too high and makes us think that everything else is pale in comparison because they come up so short. But bear in mind, legacy autos do have a lot more experience than the Chinese in building cars. Yes, China is an incredible manufacturing country and has a vast amount of resources, but that may not be enough. But why do we hear that the Chinese will take out the legacy market share? Because they can make so many vehicles. Why? Because their manufacturing is vastly superior to legacy autos? No, I don't think that's the reason. Nor do I think it is superior. Volkswagen are just about the second highest producer of EVs, about equal with BYD. The difference is the Chinese are not so battery constrained. Why? Because they use LFP batteries, and they don't care that their cars have insufficient power, poor handling and performance, and impractical range. The legacy brands are not willing to go down that path. It's off-brand. Legacy autos are maintaining brand. The Chinese have no established brands. They can get in with cheaper vehicles. This is why Legacy are betting big on nickel battery factories. These will take a while to get up and running, but before long they will be in production. And remember, we have seen how much more consumers are willing to pay for an inferior Porsche over a Tesla Plaid. Chinese brands have no history, prestige, or class that consumers are willing to pay for. Of course, when they do have their factories up and running and selling electric cars, the customers will also be given $12,500 off each car. Not to mention Legacy can still sell these cars at a loss, as they'll be able to subsidize their losses with PHEV sales. And as you know, this goes on for potentially 10 years. Most of the Chinese do not have a support system like this. Okay, so for those of you who say I'm being biased, well, let's just summarize and remember I've only been talking about the US, as that was the narrative, that the Chinese are going to saturate the market like the Japanese did in the 70s. No one is touching Tesla. They're in their own league. Anything anyone buys will be a substitute to a Tesla because they cannot wait for a Tesla, as the waiting list will become crazy, or perhaps they want something a little bit different because everyone else has Teslas. And remember, over time, Tesla will have lower cost models once they get their supply sorted. So in the meantime, what are the other options? We have Chinese EVs, which I simply don't think are of the standard of a car that American consumers want. And we also have legacy PHEVs, which may be the suitable substitute. Of course, legacy EVs slowly growing too, but that will be some time, and they'll likely sell every one of those they make. They have achieved a reasonable range, and they still handle adequately. The question really is, would American consumers choose vastly inferior Chinese cars over legacy PHEVs? Perhaps some people who care about zero emissions enough to buy a Chinese EV? But if they cared that much, it's likely they already bought a Tesla. Remember, the Chinese EVs are also going to cost a lot more than these legacy PHEVs. Anyway, it will be interesting to see how this all plays out. Thanks for listening. Please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and talk to me on Patreon.